Hi, guys. Today we're going to be starting a new novel. It's one of my favorites. It's called The K. It's by Theodore Taylor. It takes place during World War II, back in the late 1930s, early 1940s, in that area. It's in the Caribbean. This boy, Philip, his family moved from Virginia to the Caribbean islands. So let's take a look. Here's a map of North America. This is America, Mexico, South America. And over by Venezuela, there are these three little Caribbean islands. So here's Venezuela. There's these three little islands. They're called the ABC Islands. It's Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao. And Philip's family has moved to Curacao. This island is part of the Netherlands. It's considered a Dutch colony. And the reason they moved there is that airplanes is a new technology back then. And they were first used in World War I. And World War I is over. It was called the Great War at the time. And now they're in World War II and they're using these airplanes. Philip's father is an expert on making gasoline for airplanes. So they've moved to a place that has a big plant to make to make gas for airplanes. But because they are making gas for airplanes for England, when they try to transport it, U-boats show up, the German submarines. So it becomes very dangerous. And it's a very exciting story about Philip's adventures. So we're going to start today with chapter 1. And this novel in particular, and I've been reading a lot of books, it has one of the very best first lines and last lines in any book. So wait till you hear the first line. We're going to read chapter 1 today. Chapter 1. Like silent, hungry sharks that swim in the darkness of the sea, the German submarines arrived in the middle of the night. I was asleep on the second floor of a narrow gabled green house in Williamstead on the island of Curacao, the largest of the Dutch islands just off the coast of Venezuela. I remember that on that moonless night in February 1942, they attacked a big Lago oil refinery on Aruba, the sister island west of us. Then they blew up 6 of our small lake tankers, the tubby ones that still bring crude oil from I'm not sure how to say all these words, Maracaibo to the refinery, Curaçaotion, petroleum to be made into gasoline, kerosene, and diesel oil. One German sub was even sighted off Williamstad at dawn. So when I woke up, there was much excitement in the city, which looked like a part of Holland, except that all the houses are painted in soft colors, pinks and greens and blues, and there are no dikes. It was very hard to finish my breakfast because I wanted to go to Punda, the business district, the oldest part of town, and then on to Amsterdam, where I could look out to sea. If there was an enemy U-boat out there, I wanted to see it and join the people in shaking a fist at it. I was not frightened, not terribly excited. War was something I'd heard a lot about, but had never seen. The whole world was at war, and now it had come to us in the warm blue Caribbean. The first thing that my mother said was, "Philip, the enemy has finally attacked the island, and there will be no school today, but you must stay near home. Do you understand?" I nodded, but I couldn't imagine that a shell from the enemy submarine would pick me up out all from all the buildings and hit me if I were standing on the famous pontoon bridge or among the ships way back in Shokat or along the Anna Bay. So later in the morning, when she was busy making some that making sure that all our blackout curtains were in place and filling extra pots with fresh water and checking food supply, I stole away down to the old fort with Henrik von Boven, my Dutch friend, who was also 11. So now we know that he's 11. And the blackout curtains that they were talking about back during World War II, all over the world, people had blackout curtains. So at night, if your airplanes were going around, they couldn't see the lights in your house. It was make sure that they couldn't see you in the dark, and so that she was very scared of the bombing that was going on. I had played there many times with Henrik and other boys when we were a few years younger, imagining we were defending Williamstead against pirates or even the British. They once stormed the island, I knew long ago, or sometimes we'd pretend we were the Dutch going out on raids against the Spanish galleons. That had happened too. It was also real that sometimes we could see tall mast ships coming over the horizon. Of course, They were only the tattered sailed native schooners from Venezuela, Aruba, Bonaire, coming in with bananas, oranges, papayas, melons, and vegetables. But to us, they were always pirates, and we'd shout to the noisy black man aboard them. They'd laugh back and go, pow, 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 and the fort looks as though it came out of a storybook, with gun ports along the high wall that faces the sea. For years it guarded Williamston, but this one morning it did not look like a storybook fort at all. There were real soldiers with rifles, and we saw machine guns. Men with binoculars had them trained toward the white caps, and everyone was tense. They chased us away, telling us to go home. Instead, we went down to the Konig Emma Brug, the famous Queen Emma pontoon bridge, which spans the channel that leads to the huge harbor, the Shogat. The bridge is built on floats so that it can swing open as ships pass in or out, and it connects Punda with Atrabanda, which means other side, the other part of the city. The view from there wasn't as good as from the fort, but curious people were there too, just looking. Strangely, no ships were moving in the channel. The veerboots, which are ferry boats that shuttled cars and people back and forth when the bridge was swung open, were tied up and emptied. Even the native schooners were quiet against the docks inside the channel, and the black men were not laughing and shouting the way they usually did. Henrik said, my father told me there is nothing left of Aruba. They hit St. Nicholas, you know? Every lake tanker was sunk, I said. I didn't know if that was true or not, but Henrik had an irritating way of sounding official since his father is connected with the government. His face was round and he was chubby. His hair was straw colored and his cheeks were always red. Henrik was very serious about everything he said or did. He looked toward Fort Amsterdam. He said, I bet they put big guns up there now. That was a safe bet. And I said, it won't be long until the Navy is here. Henrik looked at me. Our Navy? He meant the Netherlands Navy. No, I said, ours, meaning the American Navy, of course. His little navy was scattered all over after the Germans took Holland. Henrik said quietly, our Navy will come too. I didn't want to argue with him. Everyone felt bad that Holland had been conquered by the Nazis. Then an army officer climbed out of a truck and told us to leave the Queen Emma Bridge. He was very stern and growled, don't you know they could shoot a torpedo up here and kill y'all? I looked out at the sea again. It was blue and peaceful, and a good breeze churned it up, making lines of white caps. White clouds drifted slowly over it, but I couldn't see the usual parade of ships coming toward the harbor. The stubby ones or the massive ones with flags or many nations that steamed slowly up the bay to the Shogat to load gas and oil. The sea was empty. There was not even a sail on it. We suddenly became frightened and ran home to Charloux section where we lived. I guess my face was pale when I went into the house because my mother, who was in the kitchen, asked immediately, where have you been? Punda, I admitted. I went with Henrik. My mother got very upset. She grabbed my shoulders and shook it. I told you not to go there, Philip, she said angrily. We are at war. Don't you understand? We just wanted to see the submarines, I said. My mother closed her eyes and pulled me up against her thin body. She was like that, 1 minute shaking me, the next holding me. The radio was on, and a voice said that the 56 men had died on the lake tankers that were blown up, and the governor of Netherlands West Indies had appealed to Washington for help. There was no use in asking Amsterdam. I listened to the sorrowful sound of his voice until my mother's hand switched it off. Finally, she said, you'll be safe if you do what we tell you to do. Don't leave the yard again today. She seemed very nervous. But then she was often nervous. My mother was always afraid I'd fall off the sea wall or tumble out of a tree or cut myself with my pocket knife. Henrik's mother wasn't like that. She laughed a lot and said, boys, boys, boys. Late in the afternoon, my father, whose name was also Philip Enright, returned home from the refinery where he was working on the program to increase production in aviation gas. He'd been up since 2 o'clock, my mother said, and please don't ask him too many questions. They had phoned him that morning and to say that the Germans might attempt to shell the refinery, the oil storage tanks, that he must report to help fight the fires. I had never seen him so tired, and I didn't ask as many questions as I wanted to. Until the past year, my father and I had done a lot of things together, fishing or sailing or small boat or taking long hikes around Krupp Bay or the Cerro Mayo or just going out into the Kanoko on the other side in the countryside together. He knew a lot about trees and fish and birds, but now he always seemed busy, even on a Sunday. He'd shake his head and say, "Oh, sorry, guy, I have to work." After he had his pint of cold Dutch ale, he had one every night in the living room after he came home, I asked, "Will they shoot us again tonight?" He looked at me gravely and answered, "I don't know, Philip. They might. I want you and your mother to sleep down here tonight, not on the second floor. I don't think you're in any danger, but it's better to sleep down here." How many of them are out there? I thought. I thought they might be like schools of fish, dozens maybe. I wanted to be able to tell Henrik exactly what my father knew about the submarines. He shook his head. "No one knows, Philip. There must be 3 of them around the islands that attacks that were the 3 different places." "They came all the way from Germany?" He nodded. "Or from bases in France," he said, loading his pipe. "Why can't we go out and fight them?" I asked. My father laughed sadly and tapped his long forefinger on my chest. "You'd like that, would you? But we have nothing to fight them with, son. We can't go out in motorboats and attack them with rifles." My mother came in from the kitchen to say, "Stop asking so many silly questions, Philip. I told you to do that, not to do that." Father looked at her strangely. He had always answered my questions. "He has a right to know. He's involved here, Grace." My mother looked back at him. "Yes, unfortunately," she said. My mother, I knew, had not wanted to come to Curacao in the late 1939, but father had argued that he was needed for the war effort, even though the United States was not even in the war yet. Royal Dutch Shell had borrowed him from the American company because he was an expert in refineries and gasoline production. But the moment she saw it, my mother decided she didn't like Curacao, and she often complained about the smell of gas and oil whenever the trade winds died down. It was very difficult in Virginia, where my father had been in charge of building a new refinery on the banks of the Elizabeth River. We'd lived there in a small white house on an acre of land with many trees. My mother often talked about the house and the trees and about the change of seasons and the friends she had there. She said it was nice and safe in Virginia. My father would answer quietly, "There's no place nice and safe right now." I remembered the summers and the lightning bugs and honeysuckle smells and the cold winters when the fields would all be brown and would crackle under my feet. I didn't remember too much else. I was only 7 when we moved to the Caribbean. I guess my mother was homesick for Virginia, where no one talked Dutch, and there was no smell of gas or oil, and there weren't as many black people around. Now there was a cold silence between my mother and father. Lately, it had been happening more and more often. She went back into the kitchen, and I said to him, "Why can't they use aircraft and bomb the submarines?" He was staring toward the kitchen and didn't hear me. I repeated it. He sighed. "Oh, yes, same answer, Philip. There are no fighting aircraft down here. To tell you the truth, we don't have any weapons." That's the end of chapter 1. You probably heard some things in there that surprised you. There's some racist comments about black people being made. Back in the 1930s was a time in America of the Jim Crow laws where the laws were pitted against the black people, and part of the story is going to deal with that racism. So it's in here very on purpose. Philip was raised by a mother who was very prejudiced against the black people and the way they talked about them. But this book kind of talks about that type of racism and deals with it. And so that's why I'm reading this book. You'll see what I mean as we go along. It's a really good book. So I hope you come back for chapter 2. Thank you.